Here's something that you don't see every day, maybe not ever. A great white shark filmed in the Mediterranean Sea, captured by a diving team in the Strait of Sicily during a mission to remove so-called ghost nets, trapping marine life in an offshore shipwreck. Great white sharks are native to the Mediterranean, but their survival has been critically endangered due to human activities such as overfishing. 200 feet under the Mediterranean off the coast of Sicily, two divers were doing the most ordinary job in the ocean. Cut a tangled net off a shipwreck. Bag it. Come home. They had trained for years for that depth, for the cold, for the gas math, for everything that can go wrong down there. They had not trained for what came out of the blue behind them, and they had roughly 90 seconds to react to it. One of them was shaking so hard he almost lost the camera. Wow. This is sick. Sounds like you're having fun down there. All right, so give me the scenario. What's going on? What do you see? Let me just get my bearings. What he filmed instead should not exist, and nobody in marine science was ready for it either. 200 foot down. The dive began the way every technical dive begins, which is to say slowly and with a great deal of arithmetic. Roughly 50 miles off the Sicilian coast, in the narrow and historically loaded stretch of water that separates Italy from Tunisia, known as the Strait of Sicily, a small team of divers went over the side of a boat and started down a line. Among them was a technical diver named Dirk Remmers. He was not hunting for sharks. He was not thinking about sharks. Sharks were not remotely on the agenda that morning. He was volunteering with an organization called Ghost Diving, a network of specialized technical divers whose mission is locating and physically removing abandoned fishing gear from shipwrecks and reefs. Ghost nets, the gear is called, lost or discarded netting that keeps right on doing the job it was built for. These plastic ghost nets will continue to fish year after year and kill all types of wildlife. This derelict ghost gear kills countless animals and is a major source of plastic pollution. It's a global problem, and we're not immune to it in the Salish Sea indefinitely, long after any human being has stopped paying attention to it. The descent is where the day narrows. The surface light goes first, then the warmth, then the colors, because different wavelengths of light are filtered out by the water. So, for example, in the deep blue ocean, the light gets bluer as you go down. And that's because red and green light are absorbed by materials in the water, just leaving blue light. That's why it gets red drains out of everything in the first 30 or 40 feet, then orange, then yellow, until the world resolves into a flat spectrum of green and blue and gray. At 200 feet, the sun is a rumor. The pressure at that depth is enormous. It compresses the gas in a diver's lungs, compresses the neoprene, compresses the small air spaces in a mask against the face. Every breath drawn from a regulator at 200 feet consumes several times the gas that the same breath would consume at the surface. Which means the clock a diver is working against is not really a clock at all. It is a fuel gauge, and it drains faster the deeper it goes and the harder the diver works. Then there is the other obligation, the invisible one. Every minute spent at depth loads the diver's tissues with dissolved gas that has to come back out slowly and in a specific order on the way up. It accumulates silently while a diver is concentrating on something else, and it cannot be renegotiated at the last minute because something interesting happened. A technical diver at 200 feet has bought a fixed window of time, and the window closes whether or not the work is finished. The wreck itself sat on the bottom as a collapsed sprawl of steel, softened by decades of growth. Regional marine researchers consider wrecks like it genuine biodiversity hotspots. A steel structure on an otherwise featureless bottom becomes an artificial reef. Small fish move in for shelter in the gaps and doorways. Bigger fish move in for the small fish. Moray eels take up residence in the piped work. Groupers patrol the shadow lines under collapsed decking. And sea turtles pass through on their way somewhere else. Removing it is slow, deliberate, unforgiving work. The net does not come off in sheets. It comes off in sections, and each section has to be cut free from whatever it has fused itself to, which after enough years is essentially everything. So a diver works a small patch at a time. Grip, tension the line, cut, feed the cut section into a bag, move a hand's width along, repeat. Rusted metal edges wait everywhere for a glove or a hose. Silt lifts at the slightest bad fin kick, and the whole time the gauge is falling and the decompression obligation is climbing. Remmers was not alone down there. A second diver worked nearby, close enough to be a shape in the blue, close enough to share the wreck and the schedule, and the same shrinking window of bottom time. Two people, two gas supplies, two sets of eyes, each one the other's margin for error. Neither of them was looking outward. Both of them were looking at their hands, which is why nobody saw the shape until it was already close. If this is the kind of story worth staying with, take 1 second to like this video and subscribe, because what happened in the next 90 seconds is the part that stopped an entire field of marine science in its tracks. About 3 minutes into the dive, the blue water beyond the wreck changed. And we were going down to a wreck which we knew been full of nets. So our idea and concept was to recover these nets. And whilst we were going down to this wreck, which is considerably bigger depth we found on our way down, a shape emerged from the haze at the edge of visibility. Not fast, not aggressive, just there the way a mountain is there when fog lifts. It came on with the flat, unhurried economy of motion that belongs exclusively to animals with nothing above them on the food chain. An animal that has never once in its entire evolutionary history had to think about what might be hunting it. Then it turned toward him. 90 seconds. What resolved out of the blue was a great white shark. We found on our way down, we met a big white shark, and it was based on size estimates later drawn from the footage, roughly 13 feet long. 9 feet is not a scientific distance. 9 feet is a personal one. The ascent from 200 feet is not an exit. It is a series of enforced stops at prescribed depths, each measured in minutes, all of them close to motionless. A diver coming up from that depth can spend far more time waiting than he spent working, hanging in mid-water with nothing to do and nowhere to look, holding a line and watching a timer. So Remmers had a very long time suspended in the same water the shark had just vanished into, with no way to speed anything up and no way to say a word to anyone to sit inside the fact of it. The animal itself was still out there somewhere beyond the limits of visibility, still moving, still unaccounted for. When it was finally over and the footage came up out of the water, it turned out to be something considerably larger than a good story for the boat ride home. It is now widely believed to be the first underwater video ever recorded of a living adult great white shark in the Mediterranean Sea. And to understand why that single sentence lands like a thunderclap in marine science, it is necessary to understand something almost unbelievable about this animal in this sea. Nobody was ever supposed to see it. Not like this. Not ever. The shark. Nobody sees. The Mediterranean is, technically speaking, known great white shark habitat. It has been for as long as anyone has kept records. This is not a case of a lost animal wandering somewhere it does not belong. The way a confused whale occasionally ends up in a rivermouth and makes the news for a week. And a story of whales ending up much further inland than we think they've ever been. The story is from Kakadu National Park in the Northern Territory, more specifically the East Alligator River. Well, now for the first time, humpback whales have been spotted there. Great whites are supposed to be there. The problem is that almost nobody ever sees one. Actual encounters, and especially underwater encounters, and most especially underwater encounters where a human being is close enough to make eye contact, are so vanishingly rare that researchers who study this population openly compare the odds to a lottery win, not as hyperbole, as a rough statistical description of the likelihood. Consider what that has meant for the science. Most of what is currently understood about Mediterranean great white sharks did not come from watching them live. It came from examining them after they were already dead. Imagine trying to understand how wolves live by only ever examining roadkill. A ghost with a 3-million-year history. These are not tourists that occasionally slip in through the Strait of Gibraltar and get turned around. Genetic and historical evidence now suggests great white sharks have called the Mediterranean home for a span of time that is genuinely difficult for a human brain to hold. A landmark genetic study led by researchers at the University of Bologna, examining DNA extracted from historical shark remains and museum specimens collected over the past 2 centuries, concluded that this population has likely been isolated from every other great white shark population on Earth for roughly 3.2 million years, reaching back into the Pliocene epoch. 3.22 million years is worth sitting with. For context, that is older than the earliest stone tools, older than the first members of our own genus, Homo. While continents shifted and ice sheets advanced and retreated over and over again, this specific population has been quietly circling the same enclosed sea generation after generation, largely cut off from the rest of its own kind. And the story of how they arrived there is stranger still. The genetic data suggests something that sounds at first like an error. Mediterranean great whites appear to be more closely related to great white sharks in the Pacific Ocean. What we see from the genetic data is that individuals from particular regions seem more similar to one another than individuals from other regions. But when we compare on a regional level, we see that there are some associations, such as the ones in the Northwest Atlantic, seem more similar than to their much closer neighbors in the Atlantic. Their nearest relatives are on the far side of the planet, not a few hundred miles away through the strait. Researchers believe the explanation lies in geography that no longer exists. The ancestors of today's Mediterranean sharks are thought to have traveled across an ancient sea passage that once connected the Pacific to the Atlantic. A waterway that existed before the Isthmus of Panama rose out of the sea and welded North and South America together roughly 3 and 12 million years ago. When that passage closed, the Atlantic's climate shifted dramatically, and many marine species that had lived there died out, possibly including white sharks. Scientists believe the Atlantic was later repopulated by a separate wave of white sharks arriving from somewhere else, likely the waters off southern Africa, which is why today's Atlantic sharks carry different genetic signatures from the ancient population still moving through the Mediterranean. So the sharks off Sicily are not distant cousins of the sharks living a few hundred miles away in the open Atlantic. They are a separate and ancient lineage entirely. One of the oldest and most genetically distinct white shark populations known anywhere on the planet, sealed inside a sea by an accident of continental drift and then left alone for 3 million years. That is a spectacular scientific story. It is also, unfortunately, the exact reason this population is now so fragile. The problem buried in the DNA. The Bologna research found something else in that ancient DNA, and it was not good news. Genetic diversity among Mediterranean great whites today is troublingly low. I've seen like hundreds of sharks, but now it's nothing. Sadly, just the last few years, these animals have all but disappeared from this incredible bay. A small, isolated population that has been reproducing largely among itself for millions of years carries far less genetic variation than a large, well-connected one. Low genetic diversity is dangerous in a specific way. Harmful mutations accumulate more easily, and the population carries less built-in resilience against disease, environmental change, or any new pressure that arrives faster than evolution can answer it. Researchers involved in that work have been blunt about the implication. This is likely a small endangered community, one that may be considerably more vulnerable to disappearing entirely than a raw headcount alone would suggest because its ability to absorb a shock is compromised at the level. Why this sighting matters. When the footage from the Strait of Sicily reached researchers, the reaction was not just excitement. It was something closer to relief, mixed with a sharp new sense of urgency. According to a researcher affiliated with a marine science center in Sicily who studies the region's shark populations, most of what is currently known about Mediterranean great whites has historically come from dead specimens. Animals accidentally caught and killed during fishing operations, then examined and cataloged after the fact. Live observations, and especially detailed high-quality underwater footage like this, are treated as extraordinarily valuable because they offer a rare direct window into how these animals actually move, behave, and use their habitat in real time. That is information a dead specimen pulled from a net simply cannot provide, no matter how carefully it is studied. You can measure a body. You cannot measure a behavior from a corpse. The location carried real scientific significance as well. The Strait of Sicily, that narrow, biologically rich channel separating Italy and Tunisia, is considered by some researchers to be one of the last true strongholds for the Mediterranean's dwindling great white population. A natural crossroads of currents and migratory routes, and apparently still a corridor where an animal presumed to be almost gone is quietly passing through largely unseen. The reason ghost diving volunteers were 200 foot underwater that day had nothing whatsoever to do with sharks. It was cleanup. Removing lost fishing nets from wrecks that left unattended become unintentional death traps disguised as thriving ecosystems. The mechanics of that are worth understanding because they are genuinely grim. A net that comes off a boat does not stop working. It sinks or drifts until it finds structure, and then it hangs there exactly as it was designed to hang. Fish swim into it and cannot back out. Their bodies attract scavengers, and the scavengers die in the same net, and each round of death baits the next one. Turtles surface into it and drown. Every one of those nets is still fishing. Nobody is eating the catch. Nobody is counting it. Conservationists estimate that somewhere between 3 and 10% of all fishing gear used worldwide each year ends up lost at sea, turning to a growing problem in the world's oceans. Lost and abandoned fishing gear and the livelihoods of fishermen around the globe. In Maine, for instance, an estimated, get this, 10% of all lobster traps are lost every year, which adds up to about 280,000 traps in all left behind to keep trapping and killing marine life indefinitely, unless someone physically dives down and removes it. So, this shark appeared during an active act of environmental repair. A small team of volunteer divers spending their severely limited bottom time restoring a damaged patch of ocean floor happened to be in exactly the right place, at exactly the right depth, at exactly the right moment to witness something a great many people had quietly stopped believing was still out there. The organizers behind the dive were quick to frame the encounter within that bigger picture. It was never really about a viral clip of an impressive predator. It was proof, rare and tangible, that despite decades of decline, despite pollution and overfishing and the well-documented disappearance of so much Mediterranean marine life, there is still enough biodiversity in these offshore waters to draw in and sustain one of the ocean's most demanding apex predators. An apex predator is, in a sense, a receipt. Nothing produces one unless the entire structure underneath it is still standing. A 13-foot great white cruising past a wreck 50 m off Sicily is evidence that the food web beneath it has not yet fully given out. The diver at the center of it seemed to grasp that almost immediately. In the moments after the encounter, still visibly processing what had happened, Reimers described the odds in blunt, almost disbelieving terms, comparing the statistical likelihood of the encounter to winning a lottery jackpot. That comparison traveled around the world alongside the footage itself once it was released to the public. Researchers, though, were careful to attach an important note of caution to the ear excitement. A single rare sighting, however remarkable, does not automatically mean the population is recovering. Scientists studying the phenomenon have pointed out that climate change often redistributes marine species rather than genuinely increasing their numbers. As waters warm and prey species shift their own ranges, sharks may simply begin appearing in places or at times of year where they were historically less common without the underlying population actually growing at all. More sightings could mean more sharks. Or it could mean the same small, struggling population is simply becoming easier to stumble across as everything around it rearranges itself. That distinction cannot be settled by one clip, no matter how extraordinary. And the reason it cannot be settled is built into the animal itself. They cannot leave. Great white sharks are by nature wide-ranging, restless animals. Elsewhere in the world, individuals are known to migrate staggering distances across entire ocean basins in pursuit of seasonal prey. They do not respect the tidy boundaries humans draw on maps. For years, that basic biological fact made the idea of a population living quietly and semi-permanently inside the smaller, semi-enclosed waters of the Mediterranean seem almost implausible to some researchers. The Mediterranean connects to the wider Atlantic only through the narrow bottleneck of the Strait of Gibraltar, a relatively small doorway for an animal capable of crossing entire oceans. But the genetic evidence has settled that question. This is indeed a distinct, largely self-contained group, one that has adapted over millions of years to a smaller, more enclosed range than its wide-ranging relatives elsewhere on the planet. And that long-term isolation is part of exactly what makes the population so vulnerable today. A shark population confined largely to one relatively small, heavily fished, heavily trapped sea does not have the option of swimming away from human pressure into some untouched corner of the ocean. There is also a quieter, more human lesson buried in how this particular footage came to exist in the first place. It was not captured by a large, well-funded research expedition built around the goal of finding a shark. There was no cage, no bait, no spotter, no budget line written for it. It was captured by volunteers doing unglamorous, thankless cleanup work, freeing a forgotten wreck from decades of tangled fishing line, simply trying to make one small patch of ocean a little healthier than they found it. The shark appeared almost as an unplanned reward for that quiet, unseen effort. And that is worth holding on to because it says something true about how conservation actually works. Not in dramatic single interventions, but in accumulated small acts of repair that keep the door open for extraordinary once-in-a-lifetime moments to happen at all. Nobody cuts a ghost net off a wreck expecting to make history. But the history only happens because somebody was down there cutting. Somewhere off the coast of Sicily right now, in the blue water beyond a forgotten shipwreck, there is a shark still moving through the Mediterranean the way its ancestors have for roughly 3.2 million years. Mostly unseen, mostly unknown, quietly surviving in a sea that has in just the last century pushed its ancient lineage to the very edge of extinction. For 90 seconds, one trembling diver with a camera caught a glimpse of that long, silent survival. And for the first time in the entire recorded history of underwater exploration, the rest of the world finally got to see it too. So, here's the question worth thinking about. If that diver had surfaced 10 minutes earlier or worked a different section of that wreck, nobody would know any of this. How much else is down there moving past the edge of somebody's visibility in a sea people assume they already understand? Drop your answer in the comments because the best ones tend to turn into the next video. And if this story reminded you that the ocean still has secrets left to give up, ancient ones, fragile ones we are only just beginning to understand, subscribe and hit the bell. Then take a look at the video on your screen right now. There is more waiting beneath the surface,